Imagine opening a tomb, sealed for more than 3 millennia, expecting to find the immortalized grandeur of Egypt's kings. These kings were not betrayed by enemies. They were delivered by their own bloodline, sons of brothers, grandchildren of consanguineous couples, generations sealed in genetic pacts that condemned them from birth. They sleep surrounded by gold, but the true brilliance of these tombs is not in the metal. It lies in the revelation they hide. The empire that wanted to preserve its divinity actually cultivated its extinction. And if you, like me, are interested in real stories that history books don't tell, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters. And tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I always read them. In ancient Egypt, the throne was not just a place of power. It was a sacred altar, and the pharaoh, before being king, was treated as a divine incarnation. He didn't govern, he commanded in the name of the gods. This belief created a fatal rule: divine blood does not mix. Not for love, not for politics, not for survival. That's where the error began. To keep the bloodline pure, the kings began marrying their own sisters, sometimes their nieces. And when the people asked why, the answer was always the same: the gods do not mix with mortals. The entire court revolved around this idea. The priests encouraged it, the scribes recorded it, the artists glorified it, and the servants, when they saw a prince born with an elongated skull or twisted limbs, would say, "He is special, chosen by the gods." The children themselves were raised already knowing whom they would marry, whoever carried the same blood. The palace became a closed circle, where brothers slept with sisters, and children were born as victims of a plan that no one dared to question. Genetics was ignored for centuries. Faith, treated as absolute truth, silenced any warning signs. When an heir died at 6 years old, they said the gods called him early. When a queen miscarried 3 times in a row, they said it was a spiritual test. But deep down, what existed was an empire trapped in a belief that confused sanctity with genetic suicide. The throne became an altar, royalty became test subjects, and each new generation was more fragile than the previous one, and no one saw it, because they were too busy venerating the blood, while the blood slowly was killing them. The first pharaoh to lie with his own sister believed he was obeying the gods. He didn't want to corrupt the divine blood he claimed to carry in his veins. He wanted to protect it, and with that, he initiated a chain that no successor would have the courage to break. His name was lost among so many sacred titles, but the impact of his decision echoed for millennia. By marrying his sister, this ruler created a sacred precedent, a gesture that mixed faith, power, and pride, and that would become the rule. The court applauded. The priests called it a celestial union. The people accepted without question. After all, who was worthy of generating a new god except someone with the same divine blood? But no one thought about the heir, about the baby who would be born with doubled genes, with defects hidden within the cells. The palace saw a child with strange features and fragile limbs. They said it was a sign from heaven. It was just the beginning of the chain. Over time, what was an exception became protocol. The heir to the throne was born destined to marry his closest sister. The blood needed to be protected, even if it cost health, mind, life. The decision of a single man, made between stone columns and incense, launched Egypt into an unprecedented genetic experiment. And the worst part, it seemed to work. The people saw continuity, the temples saw glory, but DNA, invisible to all, was accumulating cracks. The first link was forged with faith, but those that came after were built with silence, obedience, and fear of contradicting what they called sacred. And when the empire finally realized what it had done, it was too late. The chain was already too tight around the dynasty's own neck. The first marriage between siblings seemed to have worked. The throne remained stable, the people believed, the gods seemed satisfied. But what no one saw, not even the priests, was that the poison was already running through the veins of the next generation, and it would surface, disguised as a blessing. At first, the signs were subtle. An heir with a misaligned jaw, a princess with an overly elongated neck, a baby who took too long to support his own body. The court recorded these traits as divine marks. For the priests, the more unusual the appearance, the more sacred the blood. The artists learned to hide what they saw. They painted idealized portraits. They adjusted proportions. They hid deformities under layers of religious symbolism. The people saw beauty. The elite saw glory. But those who lived in the palace saw the real pain and couldn't speak about it. Each generation brought more evidence: children who couldn't walk, queens who suffered repeated miscarriages, princes who died before adolescence. Still, the official explanation was always the same: mysteries of the gods. No one dared to blame the sacred practice, not even the doctors. The bloodline was treated as untouchable. To question the union between siblings was to question the throne itself. So, the bodies continued to be born, twisted, and the lie continued to be sold as a miracle. In reality, what was seen in the palace corridors was not divinity. It was the biological consequence of accumulated consanguinity. With each new marriage between siblings, the defective genes doubled. What began as a characteristic became incapacity. What was read as a spiritual sign became a sentence of suffering. Egypt no longer produced just heirs, it produced victims. But since faith sustained the empire, all pain was sanctified. All deformity was rebaptized as mystery, and all tragedy was swallowed in silence so that the blood would remain pure. The deformities grew along with the silence. Each new generation seemed more fragile, more limited, but also more untouchable. Because while the body screamed for help, the system took care of suffocating any voice that dared to call it by its right name: degeneration. There was a pattern, clear, visible, repeated, but no one could point it out. Within the palaces, the children of gods grew with twisted limbs, labored breathing, faces increasingly distant from the idealized beauty on temple walls. But no scribe recorded the truth. No physician dared to connect the symptoms to the royal matrimonial decisions. The corridors of power became corridors of fear. Doctors disguised diagnoses. Servants avoided commenting. Royal mothers wept in silence after premature burials. And the priests continued to say that everything was part of divine will. Pain became dogma, tragedy, tradition. In this dynasty, speaking the truth was treason. The queen who refused to marry her brother could be discarded. The prince born with serious flaws was called blessed with a sacred burden. Even art was forced to lie. Sculptures showed perfection, while reality limped, coughed, and fainted behind the temple curtains. The silence was not just strategic, it was religious. Breaking it meant breaking with the gods, and with the throne, so everyone fell silent. And with each generation, what should have been corrected was deepened. And while the people worshipped stone statues, the flesh and bones of royalty crumbled. The empire still seemed strong on the outside, but inside it was decomposing. Cell by cell, marriage by marriage, generation by generation. The dynasty continued for centuries, not by strength, but by denial. Silence sustained the myth, and the myth fed the error until the error became irreversible. Among so many names erased by the sands of time, few still echo with as much force and pain as hers. Akhenaten was not just a queen, she was the broken reflection of a system that refused to see itself. And when the mirror broke, there was no way to hide the shards. Akhenaten was born from a royal womb. Daughter of siblings, granddaughter of siblings, raised from early on to obey and bear children. Her destiny was not a choice. It was a protocol. At 14, she was promised to her half-brother. At 16, she became pregnant for the first time. At 18, she had already buried 2 children. None of them lived past 5 years. The doctors called it hereditary fragility. The priests said the gods had greater plans, but Akhenaten knew. Each child that came from her womb already carried the weight of a sentence. One had hydrocephalus, another was born without speech. The third didn't even breathe. She tried to resist, she tried to break the cycle, but there was no way out. Her blood was gold, and gold in that court did not mix with clay. Akhenaten was admired in sculptures, painted with perfection on walls, but inside she was crumbling, from pain, from grief, from lucidity. Once she was found alone in the mirror chamber, one of the few places where she could see herself without ceremonial makeup. When asked what she was doing there, she replied, "I'm trying to find my face before it looks like my brother's." That was interpreted as blasphemy. After that, her public appearances were controlled. She stopped speaking at meetings. She was forbidden from visiting her children's tombs, and her story almost disappeared with her, almost, because what they couldn't bury remained engraved in her bones. When modern archaeologists analyzed her skeleton, they found marks of severe scoliosis, misaligned jaw, and signs of intrauterine malnutrition. Akhenaten was not just a queen, she was a scream trapped within the dynasty. If Akhenaten was the mirror that cracked, Tutankhamun was the broken image that everyone tried to glue back together by force. The most famous of pharaohs, but also the most fragile, and his posthumous glory only exists because he didn't live long enough to hide the damage. The tomb is impressive, gold everywhere, ceremonial masks, statues, thrones, but behind the brilliance, a twisted skeleton. Tutankhamun died at 19 years old, and to this day, many still call him the boy pharaoh. But the truth is different. He was never a real king. He was a decorated victim. Son of a marriage between siblings, Tutankhamun was born with a silent collection of mutations. The skull was elongated, the jaw malformed, the left foot showed bone necrosis, and the bones of the right leg were so weak that archaeologists found more than 130 walking sticks buried with his body. He couldn't walk, and when he tried, he felt pain. But the paintings showed him standing, hunting, commanding troops, driving war chariots, all lies, all propaganda. Tutankhamun's real appearance was incompatible with the idea of a god in human form. His health deteriorated each year. Epilepsy, autoimmune diseases, recurring infections. It wasn't just the body that was failing, it was the bloodline, and even so, the priests tried to maintain it. At 10 years old, the boy was married to his half-sister. She became pregnant twice. Both babies were stillborn and were buried with him. The golden mask that covers his face is considered one of Egypt's greatest masterpieces, but what it hides is a swollen, disfigured, and exhausted face. Tutankhamun was not a symbol of power. He was proof that the empire was bleeding from within. And ironically, he only became world famous because his early death prevented looters from taking his treasures. In the end, the pharaoh who couldn't walk carried in his bones the last attempt to appear divine in the face of irreversible genetic collapse. Tutankhamun was buried with honor, but not with dignity. The dynasty celebrated death as sacred sacrifice, while hiding the cracks that grew from within. And even with thrones still occupied, what truly reigned in Egypt was silence, a silence pacted with blood. Egypt seemed to be at peace. The gods were revered, the temples frequented, the ceremonies impeccable. But behind the stone columns, what really spread was disguised mourning, a peace maintained by force, where each birth was accompanied by fear, and each succession by denial. The appearance of stability deceived the ancient world. But the scribes knew, the doctors knew, and the women of the palace, especially the queens, knew better than anyone. Their wombs were becoming premature tombs. The Egyptian pax, so praised in inscriptions and chronicles, was sustained by a succession of weak bodies, affected minds, and interrupted lives. The royal line was self-destructing, and still no one dared to change, because to change, one had to admit. And to admit meant profaning what was considered sacred. The empire remained firm in appearances. Great architectural projects, religious festivals, luxurious offerings. But it was all spectacle. behind the scenes, the priests ran to find new heirs, new consanguineous combinations that could perhaps correct the fragility. But the genes were already too compromised. The damage was cumulative. The pharaohs became prisoners of a cycle they themselves created, a cycle that sold sanctity but delivered suffering. The images in temples showed immortal royalty, but the mummies, those that the centuries could not hide, told another story, a story of fractured bones, rare diseases, and desperate attempts to appear invincible when the body could barely sustain itself. Egyptian glory was on display, but its cost was paid in silence, with the lives of those who inherited not just the throne, but the curse it carried. Genetics confirmed what silence had hidden. Many of the pharaonic lineages had alarming levels of homozygosity, that is, the same genes inherited from both sides of the family. And when this happens, the risk of congenital diseases skyrockets. Religion had sold the idea that the throne was pure because the blood was closed. But science showed that it was precisely this closure that destroyed the empire from within. The gold endured, the temples remained, but the bodies told the truth. Ancient Egypt, with all its glory and complexity, did not fall only due to wars or invasions. Part of it fell in silence, cell by cell, generation after generation, decision after decision, until not even the gods could sustain the bones that bore their crowns. What began as an ideal of eternity ironically transformed into a biological trap. The same obsession with remaining divine at any cost ended up generating heirs who were fragile, sick, and marked from birth. In the end, it was not time that destroyed the empire. It was eternity itself misunderstood. The pharaonic lineage believed it was building an immortal legacy. Each child conceived between relatives was seen as a continuation of the gods on earth. But in practice, what was being built was a collective tomb, a genetic monument to silent collapse. The pharaohs wanted to control time. They wished to reign beyond death. Their tombs, writings, rituals, and pyramids were messages to the future. But the body never lies. And what their bodies began to reveal, even centuries later, was that the throne had become a biological prison. Each generation inherited the throne along with malformations, neurodegenerative diseases, immunological failures, and endocrine disorders. The royal child was not celebrated with hope, but feared with anticipation. The lineage became a sentence, heredity, a curse. And the people saw the golden thrones, the sacred processions, the images of power and eternity. No one knew that behind the mask of the God-King there was a teenager who couldn't walk, a baby who couldn't breathe, a mother who buried her third child without understanding why. This was the final tragedy of pharaonic Egypt, not to crumble at the hands of enemies, but to disappear due to errors that repeated for centuries. What seemed to protect power destroyed its foundation, and what should have guaranteed eternity accelerated the end. The throne, which was once a symbol of eternal glory, became an altar of involuntary sacrifice. Each successor inherited not only the scepter, but a marked body, a sealed destiny, and an empire that was already dying from within. Pharaonic Egypt did not fall all at once. It rotted from within slowly. It was corroded by the weight of its own ideals, purity, divinity, perfection. And while its rulers sought to eternalize themselves as gods, their very blood was digging invisible graves. Today we admire pyramids, sphinxes, mummies in display cases. But we must look beyond the gold, because the pharaoh's greatest mistake was not believing they were gods. It was believing they could manipulate life as if it were a ritual, and that the human body could endure centuries of genetic repetitions without consequences. The truth hidden in Egyptian tombs is simple, brutal, and silent. They died from what they tried most to preserve. They died from their own blood, from the pride that refused to mix, from the religion that sacralized consanguinity, and from the politics that called weakness sanctity. But this story does not belong only to the past. In different eras, other empires fell for the same error, believing that purity is worth more than humanity, that lineage is worth more than life, and that tradition is more important than health, justice, or mercy. Behind the splendor of the pharaohs, there were deformed children, queens who bled in silence, kings who could barely stand upright. The price of eternity was paid in flesh, bones, and silent suffering, hidden beneath ceremonial robes. And if even the most glorious throne of antiquity could have been corroded from within, what else might other crowns have hidden? In the next video, we will reveal an even more recent dynasty that followed the same path as the pharaohs. Consanguineous marriages, sick heirs, and decisions made not with wisdom, but with fear of losing the throne. Because sometimes power is nothing more than a castle built upon silent bones.